Now that we've reviewed these screens, let's take a look at some of the setup screens. We will review employee setup. We'll discuss project and task definitions. We'll also review the project maintenance screen, flexible key maintenance, which is a screen that supports and identifies your project ID. We'll also talk about code files and review the project controller setup screen. When we set up an employee, there are several things that are key. When you think about what you need to know related to your employees, one thing is we want to be able to charge time for our employees, and the employee might belong to one company, but the project we're charging to might be a different company. So we want to be able to associate employees to a company. We also want to make sure when we charge that employee's time that their cost is posted to the correct division or region. We also want to make sure that we can control workflow, so we want to be able to identify who their supervisor is and possibly their manager. And so those are key things, and we also obviously need to identify their rates. So let's look at the employee setup and how we can accomplish those things. So one of the things we can do with an employee is we can identify them or associate them to a company. So you'll see in the middle of the screen, the company ID field is available. That links them to that company, and all their costs can charge to that company, or it can charge to the project company if it's set up to do so, and there's a setup choice that allows those options. We also identify the sub-account that it will post to. The interesting thing is if an employee belongs to one company and they charge time to another company, a project in another company, you will get the due-to, due-from relationships between those two companies. We can also associate them to a supervisor and a manager, which allows for workflow related to time card approvals. And the other key thing that we can do is we can link them to a vendor. And this is important if we want to generate expense reports for that employee and then have that expense report generate an AP voucher for us. There must be at least one employee set up in every project installation, because we are required to have a project manager on each project, and so one employee must be associated to the project. Now let's talk about the idea of project and task. What terms do those mean, and how does Dynamics SL use those terms? So for instance, a project often exists in users' jargon, such as a job or engagement. So your company might use the term job or engagement, but in Dynamics it shows as project. We can also reference that as job or engagement on the screens for you as well. Additionally, the task is a generic term that's often used. More frequently we hear the term work breakdown structure, activity, budget, or deliverable. So these are things that we can associate as a task, and the users can identify and track costs to them. When you set up a project, we can have up to 16 characters and 6 segments. So I think this screen will make more sense if we see the screen on how you set up a project. So I'm going to go to Project, and then I'll choose my Project Maintenance screen. And I'll pull up one of the projects that I have set up. So you'll see when I have a project set up, I can choose multiple segments. So this project happens to have 2 segments with a dash in the middle. We can have up to 6 segments for a project ID, and the total length can be up to 16 characters. With a task, we can have also up to 6 segments, but we can have a total length of up to 32 characters. Now, how do we accomplish that? There is a setup screen called Flexible Key Maintenance. And you'll see there's 5 different key fields that we can associate or set up unique keys for. Specifically under this training or these courses, we're going to specifically reference or look at the project and the task. So if I pull up my project, you'll see here, I'm going to pull the project maintenance screen up in the background, and I'll also pull up the flexible key definition beside it. You'll see that the project ID, the caption says project, and then I have 2 segments. So 1, 2. Then for each of those segments, I can identify what those are. So this is the type of project, and this is a numeric value that represents the project ID. So let's say your company uses the term job instead of project. So I can come in here and I can type job instead of project. Then I can reopen the project maintenance screen. Notice now my caption is changed to the word job instead of project. And every place that the word project is identified in the system, it's now replaced that with the word job. So if I go over to journal transaction screen and I pull up that screen, this field used to say project, but now it says job. So correspondingly, I can do the same thing for the task. I can open up the task value and I can call this activity, because that's very common terminology used throughout the industry. So we'll call it activity. So again, if I reopen my project maintenance screen, we get to the right spot. Now it says activity on this tab. So it's very easy to tailor to your needs just by using one setup screen. Now let's talk about some other things in this screen as well. So I can identify the number of segments. The other thing I can do is identify the length of each segment. So this is 2 and this is 6. And going back to my project maintenance, so this field is 2 and the second one is 6. Now the other thing that I can do is I can add the type of field. So if I make it numeric, obviously I can't type the letter L where a field is expected to be numeric. I can also identify validation for that field. So what does that mean? So this is associated to a code type called 0cat. So what that means is when I'm setting up a new project, I'm going to click this blue, red, and yellow button here. And you'll notice this says type and this says project, and that comes directly from here, type and project. And if I hit the F3 key, which is the possible value list and dynamics, we'll see that this one can only have the identified items here as the first field of the segment. So I would never be allowed to type in PP for this type because PP is not in my code value list. Okay? The way this is validated is because it says we want to identify a category. So we'll come back and I'll show you how to find those categories here in a moment. Now the second field, if I F3 or choose my possible value list, nothing happens. And that's because it's not validated. This is a free-form field because there's no validation required. Now we can do validation on other things besides a predefined list that we've created. We can also validate on some IDs in the system. One of the common ones that people use for the project ID is sometimes they want their customer ID in the project field. So we can validate a segment of the project against the customer table if we desire. So those are 2 simple uses for these IDs. So let's look and see how we can validate or create this customer list. So code file is located in code file maintenance. And if I come to code file maintenance, I'm going to type in 0 or choose 0cat. You'll see there's a whole list of them. Mine is 0cat. This is project category. So we have added this list. This did not come in the system, but we've added this list where the user can come in and they can maintain their own list in the first segment of the project. So if your business changes, which we hope it does, because that means you're growing and your business is evolving. So we want to be able to grow with you and evolve with you. So we're not limited to what your business looked like on day 1 of your implementation, but we can change along with you. So we can come and add new types of project categories as you grow and change. And it's easy for the user to come in here and just change this themselves. So let's recap a couple of things that we've discovered so far. We can have 6 segments and 16 characters and 6 segments and 32 characters for the task. And this PowerPoint slide is just a reinforcement of the stuff we saw on the screen. As a reminder, when you download the PowerPoints, that you can review this further. And then this is the task portion as well. So we'll come back and look at the task, but you can see based on what I just told you, then the task is going to have up to 3 segments, and this first segment is also validated against the function code type. Okay. Now I showed you where you can change and add to the code values, and so it's under code file maintenance, and its ability to store lists, but we can it's used in other screens besides just the project maintenance screen. And we can add new lists too, and I won't show you that in this video, but we can actually add more lists to the as a possible value list for other functions throughout the system. And this is a great reference slide to kind of bring it all together. So you'll notice my task is validated, and the first segment is validated against the 0 fun, or the function code type. And if you go to the code type maintenance, code file maintenance, which I showed you, you can identify and update the code files. It's interesting because any field that uses a code file, you will always see the code type when you hit F3. So if a list is dependent on a code file, it's pretty easy to know where you need to maintain that list, because when you hit F3, if it says 0 fun, then that means you go to code file maintenance and you update it in with 0 fun. Let's look at some other setup screens then within the project module. So we're going to keep going through the project maintenance screen, and let's talk about some other key fields here that we see. So we link a project to a company. Let me get back to my project field that I was showing. So I can link my project to a company. Again, if my employee exists in one company and I charge to another company, then I can get a do-to-do-from relationship. I can also generate some start and end dates here, where we want to do, we can identify when the project ends and begins. It does not, it has no preventative function. So if I put 1998, it will not prevent me from entering a transaction past that date, but it's informational. We can associate them to contracts, which allows you to have more than one project associated to an overall contract. We can generate budgets. The other thing, we'll come back to that, but we can associate it to a sub-account. So a sub-account allows you to track your regions or divisions, and so you can have a default sub-account for each project, and that will allow any costs charged to that job will automatically have this sub-account as the default. Again, every project has to have a project manager, so that was the employee screen that we showed originally, where you can set up a new employee. And we can have a business manager. A business manager is typically the level above a project manager, so it might be a sales region or something like that. We can link them to a customer. We can also activate or inactivate a project. So we can set up a project in a planned stage. This will prevent entry from happening on that project, and then until it's made active. So this allows some workflow around creating a project. We also have our activity or our task tab. The task tab then allows you to create new tasks, and I mentioned that we can have more than one segment. So this is reading back to that flexible key. So when I hit F3 here, you'll see this function 0fun is the code file that it's using. I also have an activity tab which is freeform, and then this third segment, we've chosen not to use it, but it exists, and we could put data in there if we desired. You'll notice there's an increment button on both the project and the task. That allows us to actually increment. So let's say you have a set of projects that you want to increment from 1 to whatever 5,000 for a given year, and then you want to start at 1 again for the next year. So we can increment throughout the year and then reset that number in the next year if you wanted. Or we can increment globally across all projects. There's a lot of choices with increments. But if you use the increment button, you can put in the key field and hit increment, and it will assign the next numeric value to the project or task if that's the increment you're using. We can copy from other projects as well. Now, another key field is the budgets. And the budget tab allows us to do exactly that, track budgets on our projects. I'm going to pull up a setup of the project, the example that we were talking about in the original review where I walked through the sample data where we would have subcontract, materials, labor, and travel associated to our jobs. So this job is intended to mirror those setups. So you'll notice I have my subcontract. This is the cost that we talked about before of $600. And then the revenue expected on that per hour is $75 an hour. So I've created a revenue budget around that cost for $750. Then I have a materials cost, which was $500, and I'm expected to mark that up and apply that 10%. So my revenue on this task is expected to be $550. Same thing with travel. I had travel cost at $250, and recall if that's a pass-through cost, so I'm not going to mark it up or apply a billing rate. I'm going to bill the customer what it costs me. So my revenue or expense recovery on this one is expected to be the same as my cost, $250. And then the final one is my labor, which was 40 units, and my cost is $20 an hour. So my cost is $800, but I'm expecting to be able to bill that at $100 an hour. So 40 times 100 is 4,000. So here's the budget, which represents that data flow that we talked about earlier. So now I've budgeted both revenue and cost on my job. I also have the ability to do add some additional info to this project. And I'm going to close a couple screens because there's something I want to show you on the screen that's available in quite a few different screens related to projects. So the screen looks kind of funny in the fact that it doesn't have it has all these fields that are available or empty space, and it looks like somebody didn't plan that screen very well, or you might think that when you look at the screen. However, if I go into customize mode, suddenly a whole new world is opened up, and you can see there's actually a lot of fields in this screen, but they're hidden and I don't see them. But they're available to be used if you have additional tracking needs related to your project, and they have ID fields associated with them. And so these ID fields could be made visible and labeled with a different description, and then you could use them to track information related to your project. I'm going out of customize mode so it goes back to the same way that it was originally. So one of those fields happens to be the location. It was called ID 5, but now it's been changed to called location. And I can actually, it's had a possible value list associated with it as well. So we've put actual locations that are available to associate to a specific job. And so that's an example of how you can use these ID fields to more accurately track your project information. Let me pull a project back up. The other thing we have available is QuickSend. And if you're not familiar with QuickSend, we have the ability to send documents automatically from within the system. So for instance, we can do a project invoice or a construction billing invoice, and what will happen is when the invoice is printed or posted, or actually when it's printed in final, it can immediately send that invoice through QuickSend to your customer via email. Or we also have that same feature that's available with construction billing. There's a couple other neat things related to projects that we don't have in some other modules as well. You'll see up the top here, we can also link our projects to SharePoint. So I can hit create a SharePoint link, and if you have your SharePoint set up and all this feature and the location of where the SharePoint file needs to be created, site needs to be created, if you click here, it would automatically create a SharePoint site for this project where you could collect and store documents related to it. Let's go back to our... Okay, so now let's talk about project controller setup. So we have our project set up, we have our code files established. The last screen related to setup, or one of the key screens, is called project controller setup. And this screen has a lot of stuff. So we're going to try to identify as we go along certain fields that make sense based on the functionality we're talking about. So one of the key fields is the current period. And this actually is an editable field. If you close project, I could actually set this period back and reclose it back to period 2 if I wanted to. So I could change this to 1/1998, and there's reasons that we can do that and reclose it. We also have captions, and so we saw with the project maintenance screen, we have the ability to change a caption basically in a setup screen. Now, if you'll notice here, I have under my caption, it says project manager and business manager. Maybe I don't like that term. Maybe my company uses the word foreman and supervisor or something like that. So instead of having project manager and business manager, I'm going to call it foreman and salesman. So I'm coming over here, and so this caption, I'm going to call it foreman and regional salesman. Okay. So when I save that, now if I reopen my project maintenance screen, my label now says foreman and regional sales. So easy ways to tailor your business to match your needs. That also can tailor the employee. Now, if you recall, I showed you in employee resource maintenance the ability to set up an employee. And in here we said we can set up a supervisor and a manager. And I don't like those terms. I'm going to change those as well. So I'm going to call this head honcho and boss. Okay? So now this will now change my label on my employee. So if I reopen the employee and resource maintenance screen, this now says head honcho and boss. Okay? So very easy to tailor to what your company uses as terms. We'll cover the budget ones a little later. I also want to cover the PC options and setup screen. This also is kind of a hodgepodge of information. So we're going to pick a few items here. One of them is we talked about we can do auto increment, so that down in this area we can set up our incrementing features, and we can increment it based on a segment that's on the project or the task. We can also turn on the auto FTT. So if you recall, I mentioned that we can run financial transaction transfer. And that's the bridge that brings data from financials to project. And when I run financial transaction transfer, I can choose AP if I want to, or GL, or all. But this is how I run them manually. If I wanted to automate that so it ran on every record that as it's released, then I simply can come over here and check the auto FTT box. And that will bring things over automatically. This also can control if we allow posting to a prior period. And I also can transfer data from accounts receivable over to projects. So if I want to track my payments on my project, I can check this box. One other key field that we want to make sure we discuss is the non-post project. So let's say you're in General Ledger and you're entering a journal entry. And let's say that journal entry, sometimes it applies to a project and other times it doesn't apply to a project. We need the account category because if it ever will apply to a project, we've got to link the account category to the chart of accounts. So in order to do that, then we're saying every time that account is charged, it's going to expect a project. So how do we get around that, or how do we handle those situations when they're not project related? So we can do that. So if I come over here and I choose account 4030, the job and the activity code are required, and that's because, if we recall, if I go back to my chart of accounts, I look under account 4030. Could have picked a closer one. Okay, so 4030 is purchases, and if I scroll to the right, it's associated to account category materials. So that means every time I use 4030, it will expect a project ID. But let's say I don't really want to associate to a project. Maybe it's an internal job, and I don't want to charge it to a job. So how do I do that? If I F3, I have all these jobs. And so what I can do is I can charge it to a non-post project. And so the non-post project for this company is defined as 0. So that means if I don't want it to go to project, all I have to do is type 0 in the project field, and it will bypass flowing to project. So I'm going to type a 0 in here. And notice what happened. When I tabbed off, the activity field went from red to black. That means it's no longer required. So now this transaction would only flow to GL and not to project. So you can see that this can cause some discrepancies between your financials and your projects. So you want to be very careful when defining these non-post projects. You want to control who has access or information to that ID. This will not show in your possible value list. You have to know this field, and you have to be able to just type it from memory or come to the screen and look it up. Okay, so the other fields on the screen we'll look at a different time. The Revenue Setup tab we already reviewed with revenue recognition. So this is where we set up our postings for revenue recognition. We also have the ability to set up equipment, and equipment can be tracked on, if you're on a site and you take a bulldozer or something like that, and you want to bill based on hourly usage of a bulldozer or concrete machine, whatever it might be, we can set up pieces of equipment and then charge to them as well. We also have the ability to track billed to date. So I mentioned that every time an invoice posts, we can have billed to date update as well. And the reason you might want billed to date to be tracked is maybe there's more than one revenue account on a project. So revenue account 3030 has 1,000 and revenue account 3050 has 5,000. So you'd like to know billed to date is 6,000 rather than having to go add them. So this billed to date is a convenient way to see the total amount that's been billed on your job. We also have the ability to enter transactions in accounts receivable if we want to for a project, and the revenue would flow over to project. So all this setup screen says, if I enter an invoice directly in accounts receivable and I put it to revenue, when it flows to project, it's going to update or add to my billed to date account category. So this is just defining if I use this account category in AR and it posts back to project, it's going to update my billed to date. The last setup tab is related to what's called bill to maximum. Bill to maximum is an idea of, frequently can be used on time and material projects. It's basically saying I have a cap, and when I hit that cap, I'm not allowed to bill anymore. And so we've quoted a job, and we said that it's going to take 40 hours to do this job. And we start charging time to this project, but we go over and we're at 45. But we've told the client we're only allowed to charge up to 40 hours. So what we can do is we can set up a bill to max, and for the first 40 hours, when allocator runs, it would generate a record to revenue. But from anything after 40, so the 5 hours I mentioned, we can't bill that. So we want that to still go through allocator. We can't stop that from going through allocator, but we want to be able to track it and not accidentally bill it. So this bill to max would allow us to set a maximum for each project. We can do it at the project level, or we can do it at the task level. So we can say for consulting, we have a maximum number of hours we're going to bill. For development, we have a maximum hours to bill. And so as time is charged to each task, then when it hits the maximum on that task, it will do the same thing. Or we can make it a global project restriction. So if we look at the screen here, we can see that it will allow us to set up various account categories. So we can say when the account category is revenue and it hits revenue, then the total hits the amount that we've said is the maximum. Then instead we want to post to a different account category, and it might be like a revenue adjustment or something like that. I don't have an account set up, but let's say it's revenue expense recovery. So the first 40 hours would post to revenue, but when it sees that revenue has hit the 40 hours, then it would post the rest to some other account category that we would define, called maybe a revenue adjustment account or whatever it might be. So this is a way that we can have it automatically track this for us. And how it happens is that we can create a project maintenance, and we can set up our budgets, and then we can identify if we want the project maximum to occur. So we can say if it's the maximum is on the entire project, if it's revenue, then you got to choose the right account category, but then the maximum amount is, let's say, 5,000. So once it hits the 5,000, then it knows that that's supposed to be tracking to that adjustment account. It can be tricky in the fact that it's always the first, first in is the ones that get to count. And so if I come into the project towards the end and my 5 hours cause it to be over, mine are automatically going to be the ones that are adjusted. It's not going to adjust by a certain person. It's always going to be the last set of hours that are generated. Okay, so then there's also, let me go back to my PowerPoint here. So now we want to talk about some entry screens. There's primarily two entry screens. One is project charge entry, and then there's also a screen called project transaction transfer. Project charge entry is a screen that allows us to enter transactions that do not flow anywhere but project. So the only impact is on the project module, no GL impact, and quite frequently it's used to make adjustments. It can also be used to initialize balances. So if you're familiar with the entry of a journal entry, this is similar in the fact that, let me get to we can do a journal entry, we can also do a project charge entry. So project charge entry allows us to choose the period we're going to post to. We can link it to an employee. We can also link it to a project and a task. And we can associate it to an account category. So all transactions within project related go to a project, a task, and then a cost code or an account category. So if I want to put it to labor, I can do that. And I have to put in a date. And the rest of the records are optional. So I can put to units, an amount, whatever it might be. So now I've just essentially initialized the cost on this project to be another $2,000 to labor with no other impact but no other GL impact, but just a project impact. We want to be careful in using this screen because obviously this is another situation where you can enter transaction here and not affect GL. One of the primary reasons we see customers using this screen is that it gives them an opportunity to bring data from other systems. So if you're entering labor outside of Dynamics or expense reports out of Dynamics, then we can import or bring data in here that represents data that's been collected elsewhere, and then we can bill on this data if we want to. So Dynamics could be used for the purposes of billing, but we could transact records outside of Dynamics and pump the data in here for purposes of getting the costs in the system. That's one use that can be done. Now, just like with financials, we would release this batch, and so it goes through this release process just like you would if you were doing a journal entry. We also have a release screen here, so if you wanted to segregate duties, I can go to project transaction, project charge entry, put the batch on release later, then I can come over here to release project charge batches. So again, if you're importing a bunch of records from another system in here, if you want to bring them all in on hold, then release them in the evening or off hours to kind of eliminate processing during the day, that could be done. Another really important screen is project transaction transfer. This is another input screen. And basically the idea behind this screen is that there might be situations where you've entered transactions to a project and you found out, whoops, that's not the project I should have entered stuff to. So what do you do with all those records? Do you go back and correct everything that you entered from the screen that you created them, that is certainly a possibility. So if you entered time cards to the wrong project, you entered AP voucher to the wrong project, whatever it might be, you could go back and correct all those by doing debit adjustments or journal entries or whatever process that you find appropriate. We also have the ability to do what's called a project transaction transfer. And the purpose of this screen is to say, I want to move data that comes to a specific project to some other information or to another project. So that's one use of it. Take all the records on a project and move them to another project. We also can reclassify certain types of information that may have been wrong on an entry to the correct record. So let's look at this screen and some of the things that we can do. So I'm going to pull up one of my jobs, and I'm going to choose load. So I pulled this job up, and I have additional filters where I can limit based on a certain task or a certain account, whatever it might be. But what essentially happens is it will load the transactions for this project for the date range that I've identified. And you'll see the project, the task, the account category, the GL account, and the GL sub-account are all enabled and available. So if one of these 5 items is incorrect, we have the ability to change it in the screen. So let's say the job, it was posted correctly to the right job, and it was travel, and it was all these things. It was the right GL account, the right sub account, but I should have posted it to a different task. And it doesn't, systematically, it's not that important for me to go back to the source record to fix the task. I just need it corrected on the task itself. So I have the ability to change the task by doing a bulk edit. And I could pull up, and I want to transfer the 2 lines that I highlighted to a different activity. And I could choose the activity that I want to change them to. And then when I process this, it would create another batch to move it out of this task into another task. So let's look at the bulk edit screen and see which items. So you can see anything that's here in this left column allows me to change it to something different. So I could move it to a different project, or I can move it to a different task. I can move it to a different account category, GL account, GL sub account, or even a different company. So these are the criteria of things that I'm allowed to change. If I just had the wrong transaction date, that's not something I could use this screen for. If I had it to the wrong employee, can't use this screen for it. It has to be one of these 6 items. Okay. Now, again, we're somewhat severing audit trail, so you want to be careful in how and when you use this screen. But it is a viable option if it's a concern. Now, the interesting thing is you do notice that you can transfer to a different GL account or a different GL sub account. So that means that it actually can post back to General Ledger and create a transaction for you in the journal entry screen if it's corrected in this screen. Fairly powerful tool that's available. Just have to decide from your company perspective if an error is made, what's the best method from an audit trail and data integrity for your company to follow. So here's a screenshot of that screen along with the items that you can change. Company is also one of them, which I did not list on this slide, but it is part of the items that you could choose. We also can choose if it's been billed or not. So if it's been billable or not billable, those type of things. If we don't want to change items that have already been billed, by default it does not list any transactions that you've billed, but you can check include billed items, and those will show in the list as an item that can be reclassified. So let's review what we've learned in the first module of Project Controller. We've reviewed the sample workflow of projects and how data is so tightly integrated between project, time cards, allocator, and billing. We also have learned how we get costs to the projects, or how costs are updated on the projects, whether it be from financials, time card, or an expense report. We've also reviewed the monthly processes that you would follow, such as FTT, allocator, billing, indirect rate calculator, and then closing. And we also made a key connection between the chart of accounts and the account categories. This concludes Module 1. In the next module, we will cover project budgeting and analyzer.